you know, the truth about Lincoln, like others, and I'm going to read something interesting from LaRouche on this, is that these were great historic figures. And they didn't come out of nowhere. Like if you went to this movie, you would think that Lincoln came from nowhere. And of course, he is respected. He's a practical politician. He bought votes, but for a good reason. And of course, he was committed to the 13th Amendment, which is what the whole movie is about. Now, it's true he was committed to the 13th Amendment. He also saw it from a very strategic standpoint. That was the amendment that, as most people know, abolished slavery. Now, there's a point in that Lincoln wanted to, first of all, abolish slavery. The Emancipation Proclamation didn't do that. That was the step in the direction, but as Lincoln knew, that was an action under conditions of war. Okay, and so he took advantage of that to make the statement. But he wanted, by the end of the war, the abolition of slavery. And he wanted that also as a basis for reconstructing the nation. That's all these. He's such a central figure. These are all very important moments because a great deal of what we're living with today, a mere 150 years later, is the consequences of the failure to reconstruct the nation completely. A lot of what FDR's problems was, of course, the Southern Democrats, because the South was never really reconstructed. Yeah, with the death of Lincoln, and then with the 1876 Compromise, the South was allowed to go back to a version of oppression of black people and poor whites and so on and so forth. We never had a real reconstruction. Now that goes to a very important point, because going from the Jackson period, why are we going back 180 years? To the Jackson period. You know, Jackson was the president from 29 to 37. And indeed, the Second National Bank is not completely shut down until about 34, 35. And then we get some other things, and you'll see. But in effect, since that period, since about the middle of the 1830s, we have never had the American system. Because the American system is not a place. It's not something that was built in North America between Canada and Mexico. The American system is a very particular scientific conception of human economic reproduction, of human economic development. In fact, the essence of it is, and Diane referred to this thing in the preamble of the Constitution. For us, we, the people, in order to form a more perfect union, to provide for the security and so on and so forth, for us and our posterity. Now you think about this, you have to think about a more perfect union. Yeah, most people think of perfect as being perfect. You can't be more than perfect. But to be more perfect means a process of constant development. Constant progress, constant scientific progress, as Lynn went through in the webcast last night. And this is the basis of a credit system. So the U.S., the system upon which the United States was founded, was oriented to the constant scientific progress and the cultural basis for that for future generations. You never exist only for yourself or only for your generation or your time period. You exist as a human being to create for future generations the potential for ongoing progress and upgrading of the potential for creativity of each and every human being and as many of them as we can produce. And that's how we reproduce as a species. We don't reproduce ourselves simply biologically. We reproduce ourselves by creating the conditions for ongoing human development. And as Lynn has said recently, this means out into the solar system and existing in a way that we've never existed before. Our minds might have to work a little differently if we're dealing with all of the planets, the entirety of the solar system, and perhaps beyond. For example, you know, some people may have thought it was funny when Lynn talked about the galactic effect. I mean, that's pretty far away, you know, maybe. Well, here's an interesting point. The Oort cloud, which is the cloud of debris outside of the planets, and actually beyond even that, towards the end of what they call the heliopause, there's a mass of debris out of which at least some of the comets are formed. And something pushes one of these pieces of debris out of the Oort cloud such that it's swept into the attractive forces of the inner solar system. Now, of course, what bumps them out of their orbits? What bumps them out of this cloud? Well, it certainly becomes the case that other parts of the galaxy are now not that far away. There are stars and activity close enough that this may be, and as the solar system moves through the galaxy, there are changes in the effects on the solar system. Now, you know, some of you may recall, I think back in the mid-1990s, the Schumacher-Levy comet pounded into Jupiter. Some of these times these comets on their way through the solar system get caught by something. And in this case, it caused an event which was one of the largest events recorded of this type in human history. So what happens if a comet comes barreling toward the planet Earth, or even the near vicinity, let alone asteroids? But this is the galactic. So we have to think about a kind of extension of ourselves and what this means for the way we have to think and what kind of scientists we need, what kind of language we need, and so forth. Well, in a certain sense, the American system is built and considered to be able to deal with these kinds of problems. For example, think about the exploration of North America done by Lewis and Clark, the expansion of the United States into a continental nation, which was the conception of John Quincy Adams. And Adams conceived of doing this by developing relations with the rest of the continent and other nations. It wasn't conquest. For example, he negotiated the Canadian-US border. He negotiated over Florida. And he opposed the Mexican War because he opposed expansion by military means. So the American system was conceived of as an actual, not just patriotic term, but it was a unique economic system within which the nation state had sovereignty over the currency, over credit, and it had a way of organizing the credit of the United States to the internal improvements, the infrastructure, the expansion, the educational facilities, and so on and so forth. That was what the National Bank was supposed to do. The National Bank's mission was outlined by the Congress under Article 1, Section 8. It was effectively a private bank, but it was run under these auspices. And the idea was that the revenues of the United States would be used through the bank to initiate credit to prescribed kinds of activity: infrastructure, education, agriculture, so on and so forth. Now, credit is not money. That is, again, I refer you to what Lynn had to say last night. But the real money doesn't do anything. The basis of a financier speculative economy is the idea that you put money somewhere and you make it grow. How do you make it grow? Well, effectively, you place monetary bets that somehow the monetary value of your financial piece of paper will go up. And somehow that creates something in the economy. Now, some of these guys will argue, well, but that covers your risk and you invest it, but it doesn't happen. Because the quickest way to make money grow is to speculate on it. It's a lot big, if you want to build a surge barrier to protect Battery Park from a surge due to a hurricane, or a double surge, because some of the surge came down from the Connecticut through the East River and so on and so forth. If you don't have barriers, these rivers, the narrowing of the rivers actually makes the storm surge worse. So you don't invest in that, not just because it isn't profitable. It takes too long. It might take you 10 or 15 years to build it, to pass it, to get it through, to make it functional. Most decent investment takes a little while. You don't build a highway even, let alone a rail system. Doesn't get built overnight. And it's worth noting, so people aren't going to invest money in that if all your purpose is to make money develop, make money grow in value. What is credit? Credit might not have that much to do with actual money. People may get disappointed. It's not your credit card. Okay? Credit is something that's issued to the credit of somebody. In other words, it's the belief that they will produce something of value for the economy as a whole. And over the time that it takes to produce it, a certain amount of currency will be uttered by the federal government, by the Congress, to allow for the transfer of goods, the exchange of goods. It's based on two things. Time. It takes time to build something, and as that time goes on, materials and labor has to be paid for. And growth. Some improvement in the productivity of the economy and the division of labor. Because there's a division of labor, you're not going to just have a barter system. We're no longer at the point where 90% of the population have small farms and they can exchange apples for wheat and so on and so forth. Now that was the American system. We had internal improvements. We had the Erie Canal. Under John Quincy Adams, in the short term that he was able to serve, from 25 to 29, we built the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal. We began the rail systems. The beginning of some of the rail systems began in the late 1820s. The Baltimore and Ohio was begun in 1828, completed in 1837. The Reading Railroad. Now these were all done by state bonds and federal credit through the national banks. The biggest explosion of development in the United States was under John Quincy Adams and some of the follow-up. It began really with the Monroe administration, but Adams was the Secretary of State and had a big role in it after the War of 1812, the second victory over the British, and they brought in a new manager of the National Bank. Now, I'm giving you that background to make the point that when Jackson came in and he said, government should be a simple little machine, and we want to give you back your money, we're going to give you tax breaks, and we're not going to have any debt. Sound familiar? And we're going to build up a Democratic Party, which is what Martin Van Buren did out of New York City. The core of the Democratic Party apparatus, the press, was built out of New York City and Wall Street. Martin Van Buren was a lawyer for Wall Street. He was a personal friend of Aaron Burr. He was involved in getting Burr out of the country and getting witnesses and so on and so forth. And Van Buren was the leading advisor to Jackson. He was Jackson's vice president. He was the leading organizer of the Democratic Party as we know it today. The party form of it, the party discipline, almost like a parliamentary system, where you're not loyal to the country, you're loyal to your party. So what did Jackson and company do? They destroyed the Second National Bank, which was the means of issuing credit, and they destroyed the idea of internal improvements. which we would know as infrastructure. They said that we don't want to pay for this. You don't get money out of this. This costs you tax money. We want a free enterprise system, which was the British system. That's what Martin Van Buren wanted. Martin Van Buren, as president, said, I believe in the free market system. I believe in free enterprise, not what John Quincy Adams did, and so on. So what this was targeted at, internal improvements, the Second National Bank, protection of industry. Why protect? Think of protection of industry. Protection because the British system, which we saw implemented largely in the South at this point, was a raw materials looting. So the idea was you create a one-crop system which exports to the manufacturers of the British or elsewhere, and your entire economy is based on that one crop. Now the British, of course, this is an imperial system, and they knew bloody well this was a slave system. So this story that you get about how the British abolished slavery in 1833 and they were in favor of abolition is a crock. Okay? They did it to make themselves look clean because they knew the slave operation was being run in places like the United States, the southern United States at that point, and Brazil and other places like this, which they profited off of, and largely the Spanish monarchy ran the slave trade at this point at the behest of the British. So it was an attack on the American system by Wall Street, by the British banking financial system. Now, in a sense, what we've had since then is we've been fortunate. Why do we exist as a relatively significant nation even to this day, though we've been massively degenerated over the last 40 years in particular? We are virtually, at this point, an occupied country. We don't have a government. We have a British stooge run by Tony Blair. You know, one funny thing about Tony Blair, besides everything else, besides being an arrogant beyond belief and a twit on top of it all, I don't know how he gets that hair combed that way, but I don't have enough left to worry about. Anyway, Blair is credited. There was, in fact, this well-known actress, Helen Mirren, won an Academy Award. You might recall the movie, playing Queen Elizabeth. And Tony Blair is the big hero of the movie. Why? Because, in fact, Tony Blair is given credit for saving the monarchy when Princess Diana was killed. He did the PR for them. He taught them how to do public relations. He went to the British people and saved their reputation and told them how to look, you know, properly upset and so on and so forth. So he is a creature of the British monarchy. He is a henchman of the monarchy itself. So what has kept us going? Well, what has kept us going is a few cases, a few moments of true intellectual, scientific leadership of an extraordinary quality that you can see represented in a small handful of our presidents, for example. Not that it's only presidents, but this is the one thing to look at, the best thing to look at. Who were they? Abraham Lincoln, who saved the country from defeat in the Civil War, from being broken up, and the British wanted us broken up. The British plan, people like Slidell and Mason, who escaped, who were involved in the Trent affair when we captured them off the boat, the Trent, and Lincoln let them go because he didn't want to let the British into the war. What were they up to? They were agents for the Confederacy in touch with the British. And what was the Confederate plan? The Knights of the Golden Dawn and so on. A lot of it was run out of Canada. And this is not secret stuff. This is known, the record is there. It's never discussed. And what was the idea? You would break up North America into a Southern Confederacy. At one point, there was the idea of Wisconsin, I think Minnesota up there, being a Northwest section that was going to succeed in the middle of the Civil War. The idea was a Western secession, and maybe break the United States up into 5, 6, 7, 8 parts, so that it would not represent any significant nation-state power against the British Empire. Since the Revolution, we have been, the United States, or the American system, has been the target of the British Empire. And that, so what, you have FDR. FDR saved the United States from fascism. Not just from the war, from fascism. In 1932-33, people like Walter Lippmann, supposed liberal, were talking about how we need somebody who's effectively a dictator. And the model for a lot of these people was Mussolini. If not Hitler, at least Mussolini. And Roosevelt, in his inaugural address, said, "I will not be a dictator." Lippmann, for example, criticized him for this. "I will use the executive powers." Some people complained about that. "But we will not bring dictatorship. I will not invoke emergency powers unless we reach some further condition." So Roosevelt evoked, and if you read his public papers, in volume 2, I think, in the early pages, he describes the nature of the New Deal. And he says the New Deal was based on the preamble of the Constitution. We've had a few other people. McKinley made some efforts. Kennedy, in his short time in office, harked back to FDR, harked back to the policies of federal development of the public lands. What did Roosevelt do? The TVA, the Grand Coulee Dam, the finishing of the Hoover Dam, the beginning of the St. Lawrence Seaway. And you could go on and on. Public schools, post offices, libraries, roads, and so on. Yeah.
Before you mentioned Kennedy, you mentioned another president.
McKinley. Yeah. Okay. Now, of course, we have an interesting history. Lincoln was assassinated. McKinley was assassinated. Roosevelt, there was a coup d'etat that was avoided. Kennedy was assassinated. And there are a number of other cases, and I think in the case of, that are at least questionable as to what really happened. Harrison, who only served for about 40 days. Zachary Taylor. Again, people who had any inclination. Harrison said that he was going to bring back the National Bank. Okay? And that, Garfield, and so on. It's a lot. We've had, what, 44 presidents? Something like, I may have lost track here, but something like that. Okay? Think about what a percentage of presidents, and how many of these we know very little about. Lincoln, for example. On the same night that Lincoln was assassinated, Seward was nearly assassinated. There was somebody who was supposed to get Grant, but Grant didn't go to the theater. And so to say it was a conspiracy, in that sense, it's clear. This was not a lone assassin. This wasn't John Wilkes Booth running around by himself. Okay? Now, to understand what is the threat, what kind of leadership are we talking about that we need? In effect, we have not had the American system. We've had parts of it. We've had momentary moments, and those momentary periods have carried us through a century, almost 2 centuries, 180 years. Now, we nearly lost the country after Jackson because it set up the Civil War. And in fact, this is something in the pamphlet, so I'll just refer to it. John Quincy Adams, in 1833, said that if we continue in this direction, Note, if we destroy the Second National Bank, if we pit interest against interest, we will have a civil war. We will lose the nation. And I'll point out that Lincoln re-entered politics based on his conception that Adams was right and that we were at that point. So Lincoln came out of a specific political fight. He didn't come out of a cabbage patch. He didn't just walk out of Kentucky into Illinois and somehow, et cetera, et cetera. He was, you know, in many ways you can think about, he was picked up in the same way that some of the, under Cusa, well, before Cusa, and the Brethren of the Common Life in the 14th century, they would take young boys and bring them to places and have them translate new documents that were being discovered by Plato or others, and use that to educate the young boys of really peasants and so forth, or artisans. How was Gauss educated? His father was a bricklayer. And so he was brought into the Carolinian school at a young age, and he was given the opportunity to develop his intellectual powers. I think in the case of Lincoln, he was picked up by certain political people in Illinois connected to John Quincy Adams. And when he was in Congress, Lincoln was a supporter of Adams. In fact, he was the one who made the speech against the Mexican-American War, which Adams had been the leading opponent of. Adams did not want Texas to enter as a slave state. Adams, like no other president, went and got himself elected to the Congress and spent 18 years in the Congress and was the leading opponent of slavery in the Congress. And he wasn't really associated with any particular party. And he got up day in and day out with petitions to stop slavery in Washington, D.C. And he wasn't even allowed to put the petition on the floor. He was completely gagged until the middle of the 1840s. 8 years he fought this battle. But he was the leading voice against slavery. Now it's worth noting that Lincoln, as a young man, as a young legislator in Illinois, and another guy named Daniel, I forget his last name, passed a resolution calling for the ending of slavery in Washington, D.C. In other words, they were politically tied to the same direction that Quincy Adams was tied to. And I'll give you another example, and then I want to get to a broader point. In December 20, I'll read it from this later, December 26th of 1938, when Lincoln was 29 years old, not quite 30 years old, he made a speech in the floor of the Illinois State Legislature. And what did he do? He attacked the sub-treasury. What was the sub-treasury? The sub-treasury was what in particular came in under Van Buren, really, but it was the direction that Jackson was moving to, was that the revenues were under the executive. And the idea was that the money could not be used for any investment in internal improvements or anything. So Lincoln makes one of his longest speeches attacking the sub-treasury versus the national bank. And maybe I'll do that, and then I'll really get to something else. Just so there's no confusion, because this is what they actually brought in. The so-called, they moved the money into the states, into the state banks. Roger Taney. Who was Roger Taney? What happened under Jackson was, as Diane pointed out, they never really voted. There was no real vote against the Second National Bank. In fact, Jackson vetoed a vote to recharter it. The investigations led to nothing. What did they do? Ultimately, and in fact, his own treasurer, a guy named, I think his name was McLean, he told his treasurer to take the money out of the Second National Bank and put it somewhere else, and McLean refused to do it. So what happened? He brought in Roger Taney to be the Secretary of the Treasury for a short period of time. Who is Roger Taney? Roger Taney was an eastern shore of Maryland plantation family who supported the British during the War of 1812. And his greatest claim to fame, well, it gets worse. His greatest claim to fame was that he wrote the decision in Dred Scott, which said explicitly by Taney in the decision that African Americans are not human beings. And that's not an exaggeration. So this is the guy who took the money out of the Second National Bank and put it into the state banks, including a state bank that he made a killing off of, that he had an interest in. Anyway, what did Lincoln say? It's a long speech, so I'm just going to give you a thing. Well, of the sub-treasury then, as contrasted with the national bank, for the before enumerated purposes, I lay down the following propositions, to wit. It, the sub-treasury, will injuriously affect the community by its operation on the circulating medium. Second, it will be more expensive as a fiscal agent. Third, it will be a less secure depository for the public money. So he's in favor of the national bank and against the sub-treasury. He will attempt to answer the proposition that the sub-treasury would be more expensive than a national bank as a fiscal agent of the government. And then he goes on to the constitutionality. He said that the larger number of the signers of the Declaration and the framers of the Constitution who were in the Congress of 1791 have decided upon their oaths that such a bank is constitutional. We have also shown the votes of Congress have more often been in favor of that than against its constitutionality. We have shown that the Supreme Court has solemnly decided that such a bank is constitutional. Protesting these authorities to settle the question ought to be conclusive. I will not urge them further now. And then he goes on and, of course, talks about the role of the national bank. So Lincoln, at the age of 29, and actually there's a famous section here that's quoted in the Jackson pamphlet to give you a sense of what he thought of Van Buren and Jackson. Because I'll give you a clue why a lot of historians, for example, a guy named Willents from New Jersey, a lot of historians claim that Lincoln is in the Jefferson-Jackson tradition. In fact, the title of one book is Democracy from Jefferson to Lincoln. Most of the book is about Jackson. Because we're not talking about simple-minded democracy. A bunch of idiots voting is not a great idea. They may vote all the same way. But you have to qualify yourself as a citizen. Now, Lincoln had this to say at the end. This is the end of the speech on the sub-treasury. Now remember, this was the Jackson-Van Buren answer. It's what they replaced the Second National Bank. I want to make the point, Lincoln was in the Adams, Washington, Hamilton, Massachusetts Bay American system, not just tradition, he understood what it meant. And that's why he won the Civil War. Now, he said, okay, Mr. Lamborn refers to the late elections in the states, and from their results confidently predicts that every state in the Union will vote for Mr. Van Buren at the next presidential election. So it's about Van Buren, who was Jackson's vice president. Address the argument to cowards and to knaves. With the free and the brave, it will affect nothing. It may be true. If it must, let it. Many free countries have lost their liberty, and ours may lose hers. But if she shall, it be at my proudest plume, not that I was the last to desert, but that I never deserted her. I know that the great volcano at Washington, aroused and directed by the evil spirits that reign there, is belching forth the lava of political corruption in a current broad and deep, which is sweeping with frightful velocity over the whole length and breadth of the land, bidding fair to leave unscathed no green spot or living thing, while on its bosom are riding like demons on the waves of hell, the imps of that evil spirit, and fiendishly taunting all those who dare to resist its destroying course, with the hopelessness of their effort. And knowing this, I cannot deny that all may be swept away. Broken by it, I too may be. Bow to it, I never will. The probability that we may fall in this struggle ought not to deter us from the support of a cause we believe to be just. It shall not deter me. If ever I feel the soul within me elevate and expand to those dimensions not wholly unworthy of its almighty architect, it is when I contemplate the cause of my country, deserted by all the world beside, and I standing up boldly and alone and hurling defiance at our victorious oppressors. Here without contemplating consequences, before high heaven, and in the face of the world, I swear eternal fidelity to the just cause, as I deem it, of the land of my life, my liberty, and my love. And who that thinks with me will not fearlessly adopt the oath that I take. Let none falter who thinks he is right, and we may succeed. But if after all we shall fail, be it so. We still shall have the proud consolation of saying to our consciences and to the departed shade of our country's freedom that the cause approved of our judgment and adored of our hearts in disaster, in chains, in torture, in death, we never faltered in defending. Now that's his view of Jackson and Van Buren and what they mean as against what he stood for at the age of 29. So, you know, this was no country yokel. It is true he had a little formal education. You can also even hear in the way he, even at that age, though later it was better, the way he studied Shakespeare. He was a student of Shakespeare. In the 1,500 days that he was president of the United States, he saw at least 100 dramas. And I think about 40 of them were Shakespearean. In fact, one of his best friends was John Wilkes Booth's brother. Well, he wasn't a best friend, but he went to the theater with him, a world-famous actor, considered the greatest American Shakespearean actor. So this is Lincoln. Now, I think in that, I'll come to some other things on it. In that context, and to realize that he's consciously picking up the banner of the American system. You know, as he said, famously said, I don't know if Diane quoted this, famously said, you know, he was asked about his program when he was in the state legislature. And he said, my program is short and sweet like the old ladies' dance. The national bank, internal improvements, and tariffs. And that's what he did as president. Remember, and this goes back to this thing about the movie and whatnot, he in the midst of the Civil War, he began the Transcontinental Railroad. Agriculture and mining schools across the country were developed by land grants from the Lincoln administration during the war. The U.S. rail system overall expanded by more than double or triple. There were advances in locomotives. Public schools, you know, and so on. Universities or agriculture, a lot of like places like Texas A&M and Iowa A&M and so on and so forth. These are agriculture and mining schools. The whole idea began with Lincoln. So his idea was a vast expansion of science, and I'll give you another example of that in a few minutes. Now, Lynn said something in an interview, this goes back a few years, which I want to read to people, because I think it takes it at another level. Let me get the right quote. Interviewer, we are coming up on the 200th anniversary of Lincoln's birth. So this is back in 2009. And Lynn, when you were speaking of the question of leadership, clearly Lincoln understood the principle of poetry. LaRouche, well, all great thinkers. Franklin Roosevelt in his own way also. Any person who is a great person has a sense of poetic expression, and it is classical music poetic expression. This is obviously the case with Abraham Lincoln, and it was also the case largely with Franklin Roosevelt. Franklin Roosevelt's cadences, his manner of speaking, the way he formulated ideas were an essential part of his power as a leader, just as Lincoln more significantly, of course, But Roosevelt had much the same tradition. But always it's an attempt to convey real ideas. And in this time, the problem is we live in a period of complete sophistry. Like Lincoln, for example. You had people who actually could express ideas. And you had great music and great composers to develop the ability to express ideas. Express them, yes, in a persuasive way, because that's important, but also to get people to suddenly see a vision of an idea. It's what the great poet does, and the great musician does, the great composer. And so from Lynn's standpoint, and you see this in a few rare people, great political leadership is not like what we talk about with politicians. Great political leadership is statecraft. And as Schiller says, the highest form of art is freedom, statecraft. This kind of development. And this is what motivated, moved Lincoln's conception of justice, Lincoln's conception of fairness. He was able to learn. He was able to develop. He was able to use that development in understanding of the American system. Even as a young man, and what happened to Lincoln? Look, you have to understand, a lot of people throw a lot of things around about a guy like Lincoln. He was really a racist. His wife was actually not his wife. He was a slave owner. Then when you press them on the point, they'll say, well, no, but his wife was a slave owner. Then it turns out his wife's family were slave owners, and they were from Kentucky, but that was his wife's family. That wasn't Lincoln. That wasn't his wife. So, the idea that he was a racist. Lincoln himself says, his view is based on the Declaration of Independence. All men are created equal. He sometimes had his doubts that the races could get along. He had his doubts that white people could handle it. He also had his doubts that the slaves would want to live with the people who enslaved them. These things raised questions in his mind. But he had no question that slavery was an evil and that the nation could not survive. He says in the famous House Divided speech, a nation of a divided house cannot survive. But he knew even more fundamentally that a nation that was slave, and that was the whole issue. And people like Lincoln, their whole point was to do it constitutionally. So the main fights were over Washington, D.C. Why? Because it was under federal control. Therefore, the federal government could change the law in Washington, D.C., which is why Adams used that as an example. Secondly, the fight was over the expansion of slavery, because the founding fathers believed that slavery would disappear if there was real development, if the South were industrialized. And that was the basic idea. That's why the law was in 1808, the slave trade had to stop and so forth. But they had to incorporate the southern colonies to defeat the British. And the southern colonies were the plantation colonies, tobacco and then later cotton. And so in incorporating the southern states, they left open the question of slavery. They were against it, and I would refer you to Lincoln's Cooper Union speech. He gave a speech not too far from here in New York City in 1860, where he argues very cogently that the signers of the Declaration, the creators of the Constitution, were anti-slavery in the vast majority. What happened was that the British, because of certain things going on in Europe, confused some of the political leadership in the United States. There were splits amongst the founding fathers, particularly after the death of Franklin and then Washington, and ultimately the murder of Hamilton. And so people like Jefferson, who was a questionable character anyway, and Adams began to divide over the French versus the British and so on and so forth. And what really developed was in Boston in particular and in New York, a financial layer who depended on the cotton trade or the free trade, their dealings with Great Britain, and ultimately the cotton trade. So you had, in 1814, you had the Hartford Convention. People may not realize that the threat of the Hartford Convention, which was the New England states, threatened to secede first because they didn't want tariffs. They didn't want protection of industry. They wanted free trade. So during this period, there was a certain breakup of the leadership of the country. This was somewhat brought back together in the Monroe, particularly the second Monroe administration, with John Quincy Adams and the period that I referred to. And these are the kinds of things that were understood, were known. So they wanted slavery out. But when the country led it down this path and they couldn't unify themselves, the southern states chose slavery. Now it's worth noting that the Confederate Constitution, what does it do? Much of it sounds like the Constitution. There are a few exceptions. What does the Confederate Constitution leave out? The general welfare clause of the preamble and Article 1, Section 8 is left out. And they have an explicit clause that says you can spend no money on internal improvements. You can't have infrastructure that encompasses the states. It can only be done by individual states. The Confederate Constitution is based on states' rights. Sound familiar? The government oppresses you. And yet, without the government, there are no universalizing projects. There are no projects that unite the nation as a nation. And so slavery was spread largely after the Hartford Convention and the bringing in of cotton. And people talk about the cotton gin, and so these things made an impact. But it was a decision to go with free trade, the British system, against the American system in the Confederate States. Right. Even states that try to do things within the state. For example, one thing that happened in Illinois, somewhat modeled on the idea, Lincoln led a group of state legislators who passed a number of bond issues to develop the internal rail system in the state of Illinois. Canals, rails, massive project. It failed because of the crash in 1837. And actually, it didn't totally fail, but during the period of 39, 40, 41, 42, it blew out and it was not completed. Ultimately, that very same project was completed, which made Illinois the center of the national rail, Chicago, the center of the national rail system, and the Mississippi and so forth. But unless you have a universalizing sense of the nation, where you recognize that improvements to the infrastructure of the nation creates the conditions under which the population is able to lift itself beyond the existing level of technology, beyond the existing level of science, and that the nation will invest in that, where no independent business is going to make that kind of broad investment.
That's right. Lincoln put in a regulation of the gauge of the rail, because all the states had a different gauge, and the gauge was based upon the width of the wheels of a chariot during the Roman Empire.
All right. But the important thing is making the gauges the same. Okay? So this is all, Lincoln understood that the nation was built to be against slavery. Therefore, the extension of slavery into the West would destroy the nation. Would turn, as he said, we will either be all slave or all free, but not half and half or 2/3 and 1/3 or anything like that. Now consider what Lincoln was. Lincoln, his conception of law as a lawyer was based on a Platonic conception of law. In fact, he writes explicitly something that most people would not attribute to a lawyer today. You know, because what are lawyers famous for today? They can defend anybody. They can make an argument for anything. They can be a prosecutor or a defense attorney for the same guy. We're hired guns. I've heard lawyers say that. Okay? Lincoln argues exactly the opposite. He would never take a case where he didn't believe in the case of the person he was defending or otherwise. He said you can't do that. Because in any proper sense, the law, justice is a pursuit of truth. And if you know something isn't true, then you can't defend it. And Lincoln says, because look, let me make a point. The abolitionists were a British operation. Many well-intended people were part of it, got sucked into it. But what was the abolitionist line? We should have nothing to do with the slave states. It besmirches our honor. So we should secede from the South. Yeah. People like William Lloyd Garrison, yes. Not every abolitionist, but this is the way the thing worked. And they were closely tied in to the abolition societies in Great Britain. They were financed from Great Britain. And the idea was to split it, to take somebody like Lincoln and get him caught between the two sides. And Lincoln said, no, because let's face it, if you're an abolitionist and you say you want the end of slavery, then you must want the Union to stay together, because if the Union is divided, then we will have slavery. The South will be slave. And it can expand to the West. But to be an abolitionist in the sense of wanting to let the country go to hell was to effectively be in favor of slavery. And so he said, I want the Union first. Without that, we don't have the power to end slavery. And so he tells Greeley in a famous and ironic comment, he says, if I have to keep all the slaves to save the Union, I'll keep the slaves. If I have to let all the slaves go to keep the Union, I'll let them all go. If it has to be half and half, it'll be half and half. But we're fighting for the Union. I'll give you another example, however, to show you what the ironic juxtaposition of what he said to Greeley, which was truthful, and then what he said to a bunch of people, Unionists in Illinois, who wanted to break, who were against the Emancipation Proclamation. And let me give, just to give you a sense of that. All right. Your letter inviting me to attend a mass meeting of unconditional Union men to be held at the capital of Illinois on the 3rd day of September has been received. Then he basically says he'd like to be there, but he couldn't, so he sent the letter. There are those who are dissatisfied with me. To such I would say, you desire peace, and you blame me that we do not have it. But how can we attain it? There are but 3 conceivable ways. First, to suppress the rebellion by force of arms. This I am trying to do. Are you for it? If you are, so far we agreed. If you are not, a second way is to give up the Union. I'm against this. Are you for it? If you are, you should say so plainly. If you are not for force, or yet for dissolution, there only remains some imaginable compromise. Now remember, he's talking to his supporters. I do not believe that any compromise embracing the maintenance of the Union is now possible. All that I learned leads to a directly opposite belief. The strength of the rebellion is its military, its army. The army dominates all the country and the people within it. Now this is true. Lincoln, a lot of what was going on was the generals and the politicals, particularly the Democratic North, were saying, let's hold a position and negotiate. Let's hold a position and negotiate. And of course, negotiation meant compromise with slavery and with everything about the South. It meant effectively recognizing the South. And Lincoln said, no, you have to destroy the Army of Northern Virginia. The only strategic way to succeed is to defeat their ability to fight. And so he did that. And that caused a lot of what he knew would be problems after the war, but he had to do it. And he had a whole idea of Reconstruction. Remember, the Reconstruction was destroyed by the assassination. But anyway, I'll go to the end. You say that you will not fight to free Negroes. Some of them seem willing to fight for you, but no matter. Fight you then exclusively to save the Union. I issued the proclamation on purpose to aid you in saving the Union. Whenever you shall have conquered all resistance to the Union, if I shall urge you to continue fighting, it will be an apt time for you to declare you will not fight for the free Negroes. I thought that in your struggle for the Union, to whatever extent the Negroes should cease helping the enemy, to that extent it weakened the enemy in his resistance to you. Do you think differently? I thought that whatever Negroes can be got to do as soldiers leaves just so much less for white soldiers to do in saving the Union. Does it appear otherwise to you? But Negroes, like other people, act upon motives. Why should they do anything for us if we will do nothing for them? If they stake their lives for us, they must be prompted by the strongest motive, even the promise of freedom. And the promise being made must be kept. So this is talking to his own supporters. He didn't hold back too much. He wasn't, because he had a conception of a nation that was supposed to create a certain kind of individual, a certain kind of citizen, not the other way around. If the citizens were backward, then they were not to be listened to. And he took that upon himself, and that, without Lincoln, we would have lost the Civil War. Or we would have compromised our way out of it. And the British were simply waiting for the moment to recognize the South. The only reason they didn't recognize the South is because they thought the North might win. In fact, as a sidelight, this was the whole point behind the Gettysburg Adventure. The Gettysburg Adventure was a fool's adventure. They had no supply lines. They were outnumbered, and so on and so forth. So why did the genius Robert E. Lee do this? He wasn't a genius, but you know, why did he do it? Because he wanted to get a victory that would give the British an excuse to recognize the South. And that's why Gettysburg was important. It failed. And the British had observers right there on the Confederate side. So you have to recognize that Lincoln was a strategist, just like Washington was. That these people had a conception of a nation state that guided their sense of what they should be doing. Now beyond that, in Lincoln's case, he also had a conception of the nature of mankind, which I wouldn't say is as developed as Lynn's, but it's in this. You can see the commonality that comes out of a conception that does root itself in what I've referred to as the American system. And this is a famous thing. And by the way, it's funny because a lot of biographers treat this as though it's silly. And you know, Lincoln is trying to write something, and he said in a letter it wasn't what he wanted. It didn't come out as good as he wanted. But they make fun of him for trying to go into an area that he didn't know anything about. And it's worth noting that, of course, Lincoln's leading economic advisor was Henry Carey, who was the son of Matthew Carey, with whom Nelson Biddle worked. Now, why do I say Nelson? Nicholas Biddle, who was the head of the Second National Bank, worked on the Pennsylvania Society for the Improvement of Manufactures, which was moved from Massachusetts to Pennsylvania, as Lynn went through it some last night. But it was Biddle, Matthew Carey, then you have Henry Carey, and Henry Carey was the economist who was the leading advisor on economic policy, in particular, the American system versus the British system, which he wrote about on numerous occasions. But anyway, Lincoln has a speech, Discoveries and Inventions. All creation is a mine, and every man a miner. The whole earth and all within it, upon it, and round about it, including himself, in his physical, moral, and intellectual nature, and his susceptibilities, are the infinite various leads from which man, from the first, was to dig out his destiny. In the beginning, the mine was unopened, and the miners stood naked and knowledgeless upon it. Fishes, birds, beasts, and creeping things are not miners, but feeders and lodgers merely. Beavers build houses, but they build them in no wise differently or better now than they did 5,000 years ago. Ants and honeybees provide food for winter, but just in the same way they did when Solomon referred the sluggard to them as patterns of prudence. Man is not the only animal who labors, but he is the only one who improves his workmanship. This improvement he effects by discoveries and innovations. And then he goes on from that to say the first improvement was clothing and so on and so forth. And then he begins to talk about the development of technology. He's got a history that's somewhat of the time. But what was his conception? His conception was that it's the ability of the human species to discover principles that changes the way we build our homes. We're not like the beaver. That changes our relationship to nature. And as Lynn has said recently, in effect, we evolve as a species. We become a different species in the modality in which we reproduce ourselves. In one sense, we haven't caught up with some aspects of our own evolution. We know nuclear energy. We know nuclear physics. We are on the verge of great advances in energy flux density, way beyond the imagination. And if you think of what we've been through just in the last 200 years, think of the difference between the early steam engines and thermonuclear fusion. These are leaps of orders of magnitude way beyond the previous couple million years of human existence. We're now on the verge of another orders of magnitude change. And therefore, we as a species, in terms of our thinking about how the way the universe works, have to get beyond the limitations of the planet or sense perception and move beyond this to something where we understand that it's universal principles that guide the universe. And this allows us to improve our power over the universe. It allows us to expand our species. And it gives us what Lynn has referred to as a quality of species immortality. As individuals, we're not immortal. That may upset people, but it's just the way it is, at least for now. But as a species, we have a unique character. Animal species always go extinct. See, the greens are crazy. They really are just completely, a lot of what's believed today is completely, it wasn't, you know, you couldn't have done this in the 19th century to somebody like Lincoln or the people around him. Growth is bad. Okay, a species goes extinct, human beings did it. And since we dominate the planet, every species that goes extinct because of us. Now, of course, the problem is species went extinct way before we got here. Millions of them went extinct. Most species that have existed on this planet have gone extinct or will go extinct because they don't change, or they're unable to change with respect to changes that go on all the time. The planet changed before human beings got here. There were periods of global warming. In fact, how many people know what is believed to be the warmest period on the planet? At least in the last billion or so years. Yeah, it was about 60 about 65 to 70 million years ago, right after the extinction, right before the extinction of the dinosaurs. The average temperature was 84 degrees, and God knows what was going on. And actually, it's a period where there's a development of a lot of mammals. Global warming, forget it. People don't know what they're talking about. But it's all used to create an environment against scientific progress. One of the things that's happened, and you look at the British monarchy. Look at they love to breed horses. Okay, and they did, and the Queen, right? All right, all this breeding, genetics. My theory is that the reason Kate Middleton has such bad morning sickness is who knows what's inside. We could have another version of Rosemary's Baby. I don't know. All right. So but you have to realize this is a battle of cultures. And what Lincoln represented, actually there's some fun side stories. Like the only president ever to get a patent was Lincoln. He patented, I don't think it was too useful, but he patented a pontoon kind of device to lift ships up to get over bad spots in the river where the draft was too low, and so on and so forth. And it was patented as a legitimate invention. So he's the only one who ever did anything like that. Okay? So he's not the character that people think of. This is a guy who could quote Shakespeare, and he did to his cabinet. Whether it was Hamlet, or famously on the boat, he was meeting with the cabinet. I think it's before he met with these commissioners from the South, led by the Vice President Alexander Stephens, where he was doing this to say, I negotiated with them. And of course they refused, and so on and so forth. But prior to the meeting, he had a meeting with his cabinet, and he quoted from Macbeth. Now, one of the reasons that he, in particular, at that period, was focused on Macbeth was because it struck him that many of the leaders of the Confederacy, or at least their parents, had fought in the American Revolution, had been founders of the United States. And yet, they now had turned against, in a sense, their own heritage, their own basis, as Macbeth. He had turned against people. So, he uses, like, for example, the idea in this book, The Team of Rivals. The idea, well, what was he doing? He was gathering around him all the other presidential candidates so he could, keep control over them and so forth. There may be some element of that. But he was doing something a little more profound. This was above party. Fighting the Civil War meant that you couldn't have a divide in the North between the parties. So he had to organize the leadership of the parties, which became his cabinet. And some of them didn't get along with him very well, like Blair and so on. There was a long battle between him and Stanton before Stanton realized. And what happened to all these guys, Seward, who himself had presidential ambitions, is they came to realize in the course of the Civil War itself, even Chase came to realize that Lincoln stood head and shoulders above them. That he had a commitment and knowledge and a comprehension that they couldn't match. That without him, there wasn't going to be anything. And what was his commitment? His commitment was to that which Quincy Adams fought for. His commitment was to bring back the American system. Internal improvements he succeeded at. Tariffs, he helped protect the steel industry and the development of the steel industry. he did not get the Second National Bank. This had been destroyed under the Jackson period, and there was still too much political opposition. Just like Roosevelt had to put together the Reconstruction Finance Corporation as a way, in effect, of getting around the lack of a national bank. It existed. He turned it into a credit-generating facility. So the battle that Lynn referred to last night on the webcast, when he talked about the three-part program, Glass-Steagall to clean the garbage out. And that's all it can take, is taking the garbage out, clean the place up, save people from disease. A credit system, a national bank, and great science driver projects. NWAPA, the Mars Project, and so on and so forth. This is exactly what would be today's version, upgraded and so forth, of what was done by Hamilton, of what John Quincy Adams did, of what was at least hegemonic in the country up until the Jackson period. Remember what Washington said about parties. Faction. Madison said the same thing. Factional sectarian strife will destroy the nation. You can have parties to discuss ideas, but once you get to the point where people vote out of loyalty to the party instead of what they believe is right for the nation, then you lose the nation. In fact, there's a good little section from Quincy Adams on this. One shot, it's one or the other. Okay. I think it's this. Connected with the other, he's talking about Jackson's inaugural speech, where this is where he talks about the government is a simple machine, it's only to defend you. We want to give you, connected with other effective recommendations to abandon all further purposes of national internal improvement and all future revenues from public lands, with the hand of ruin raised against credit and currency, in the denunciations of the Bank of the United States, and at the root of all, the proclamation of the principle that the wealthy landholders, or in other words, the slaveholding planters of the South, constitute the best part of the national population. They can perceive nothing other than a complete system of future government for this union directly tending to its dissolution. A system totally adverse to that which has prevailed from the establishment of the Constitution till the day of the delivery of the message. A system altogether sectional in its character, wasteful of the property of the nation, destructive to its commerce, withering to its future improvement, blasting to the manufacturers and agriculture of 2/3 of the states, and looking in its ultimate results to the sacrifice of labor of the free to pamper with bloated profits of the owners of the slave. So this is what he saw as the outcome of sectionalism, of private over the nation, of the party system, and so on. And this is exactly what Lincoln saw. And this is what Lincoln, what you have to recognize is he was assassinated. He had a conception of reconstructing the nation. He had a conception of the spread of internal improvements. He was clear, he knew what the British problem was, and so on. Now I'm going to give you a good example of what I mean by the poetic quality. You know, one of the big stories that comes up is who wrote the end of the first inaugural address? Lincoln gave it, and many people want to argue that Seward wrote it. Now Seward had a decent. In fact, the woman who one thing you got to watch about the movie, Doris Kearns Goodwin, first of all, loves Obama. Now that doesn't mean everything. Huh? Yeah. A big supporter of Obama. Secondly, she has, while she has a lot of interesting stuff in the biography, it's all oriented to he was a practical politician, a team of rivals. You know, she does have material on his Shakespeare more than I've seen in many other places. But she's also tries to sort of argue that Seward was, in some ways, the man behind Lincoln, even though Seward himself admits that despite his doubts in the beginning, Lincoln was the key figure. In fact, so let me just give you something interesting. Also, it's a good study in the difference between a poetic and less than poetic expression of an idea. This is the end of the first inaugural, which you'll recognize. I close. This is Seward's version. We are not, we must not be, aliens or enemies, but fellow countrymen and brethren. Although passion has strained our bonds of affection too hardly, they must not, I am sure they will not be broken. The mystic chords which, proceeding from so many battlefields and so many patriot graves, pass through all the hearts and hearths in this broad continent of ours, will yet again harmonize in that ancient music when breathed upon by the guardian angel of the nation. So this is Seward. It's not a bad idea. Let me give you, without deciding who wrote what, Lincoln's version of that same ending. I am loath to close. We are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies. Though passion may have strained, it must not break our bonds of affection. The mystic chords of memory, stretching from every battlefield and patriot grave to every living heart and hearthstone all over this broad land, will yet swell the chorus of the Union when again touched, as so surely they will be, by the better angels of our nation. So there's a quality of difference in a unified, composed idea, even though Seward gets credit for being part of developing the idea. And you see this in the second inaugural, where, you know, you think about it, no triumphalism. He basically says, we have all suffered the iniquity of slavery. And maybe we've all been penalized for letting slavery be. And now it's time to bind up the wounds with malice toward none and charity toward all. And this is why he was assassinated. Remember, he makes this March the 4th, and on April the 14th he's assassinated. Only 5 days after Appomattox. So when you think about history, you have to think also, where are we now? We have the party system par excellence. We've got a British agent in the White House and a British agent running loose in Chicago, Tony Blair. All right? And we've lost, think of the idea of the word progress. You can't even say progress without people laughing at you. You must be, you know, old school. Progress. Who believes in progress? Progress creates pollution. Progress creates too many people. Progress is a bad thing, fundamentally. That's the green outlook. Progress used to mean the development of the human species. It used to mean the greater that your children would be better, smarter, have greater opportunities than you had, and that this would be because the nation itself had a mission among other nations. As Lincoln concludes in the second inaugural, his last words are to all nations. So this idea of jingoism or chauvinism is foreign to his idea, or other people like Adams, to their idea of patriotism. Now, I think I'll, even if my reading isn't that great, because I also want to, it's useful to continually kind of, I hope, if you reflect a little bit, shock people out of, or at least realize that the shibboleths, free enterprise, capitalism. We're a capitalist country. We're a free enterprise country. We have to bail out Wall Street because it's the capital of Wall Street that runs the nation. The only thing in the nation too big to fail is Wall Street. Even the nation isn't too big to fail. But Wall Street, that's because, you know, that's what we are. We have, Lincoln has an address before he's the president. And I'm not going to read the whole thing, but I'll read you a section of it, which is very explicit on the nature of the United States. Now, first of all, I'll tell you, it's at an agricultural fair, and he talks about, he's very much talks about, in his own way, a certain intensity of development. It is to be hoped that the steam plow will be finally successful. And he talks about thorough cultivation. And what he means is that by the proper cultivation, we can get more out of labor, what Lynn called last night the productivity of labor. In other words, the farmer can work in the same time 5 acres instead of 1 acre. And he therefore gets 50 bushels in the same time instead of 10. Or maybe he gets 50 bushels out of 1 acre. And therefore, he, in 1/5 the time, produces the same quality. What does this take? It takes what Lincoln calls thorough cultivation, by which he means the introduction through scientific means of new technologies, new energies, and so forth. He talks at one point in all this, book learning is available. A capacity and taste for reading gives access to whatever has already been discovered by others. It is the key, or one of the keys, to the already solved problems. It gives a relish and facility for necessarily pursuing unsolved ones. The rudiments of science are available, and highly available. Some knowledge of botany assists in dealing with the vegetable world, with all growing crops. Chemistry assists in the analysis of soils, selection, and application of manures, and in numerous other ways. The mechanical branches of natural philosophy are ready to help in almost everything, but especially in reference to implements and machinery. Education, cultivated thought, can be combined with agricultural labor, or any labor, on the principle of thorough work, and so on. I mean, this is the same as Hamilton's artificial labor, manufacturing. This is the idea of actual physical economy. This is what people like Lincoln were. They weren't just, you know, yes, he had a wonderful sense of humor. I don't mean to diminish that. But to, you know, to sort of pose him as a folksy hero misses the point entirely. And I'll give you another quick flavor of it. The world is agreed that labor is the source from which human wants are mainly supplied. There is no dispute upon this point. From this point, however, men immediately diverge. Much disputation is maintained as to the best way of applying and controlling the labor element. By some it is assumed that labor is available only in connection with capital, that nobody labors unless somebody else owning capital somehow, by use of that capital, induces him to do it. Having assumed this, they proceed to consider whether it is best that capital shall hire laborers and thus induce them to work by their own consent, or buy them and drive them to it without their consent. Having provided so far, they naturally conclude that all laborers are necessarily either hired or slaves. They further assume that whoever is once a hired laborer is fatally fixed in that condition for life, and thence again that his condition is as bad as or worse than that of a slave. This is the mudsill theory, basically the theory that people come out of the mud. But another class of reasoners hold the opinion that there is no such relation between capital and labor, as assumed, and that there is no such thing as a free man being fatally fixed for life. In the condition of a hired laborer, that both these assumptions are false, and all inferences from them groundless. They hold that labor is prior to and independent of capital, that in fact capital is the fruit of labor, and could never have existed if labor had not first existed. That labor can exist without capital, but that capital never have existed without labor. Hence they hold labor as superior, greatly the superior of capital. And from the rest of the context, it's clear that that's what Lincoln thinks. Now, how many people could say that today and not get run out of a university? And this is what he believed. It's not socialism. He believes in private property and so forth. But his view is that the development of the productive powers of labor is the source of development and the sign of development. That otherwise capital goes obsolete. In real terms, you want to have more and more capital and a higher rate of attrition, which represents scientific and technological advance. In fact, the Mudsill theory assumed that labor and education are incompatible, and any practical combination of them impossible. According to that theory, a blind horse upon a treadmill is a perfect illustration of what a laborer should be. All the better for being blind that he could not tread out of place or kick understandingly. According to that theory, the education of laborers is not only useless, but pernicious and dangerous. In fact, it is in some sort deemed a misfortune that laborers should have heads at all. These same heads are regarded as explosive material, only to be safely kept in damp places, as far as possible from that peculiar sort of fire which ignites them. A Yankee who could invent a strong-handed man without a head would receive the everlasting gratitude of the Mudsill advocates. But free labor says no. Free labor argues that as the author of man makes every individual with one head and one pair of hands, it was probably intended that heads and hands should cooperate as friends, and that that particular head should direct and control that particular pair of hands. And but then he says, and that being so, every head should be cultivated and improved by whatever will add to its capacity for performing its charge. In one word, free labor insists on universal education. Now, I think you get a much different sense of even what the Civil War was really about. It was about slavery. It was about the British system. It was about a degraded conception of humanity which had been prevalent and hegemonic. And the American system of the revolution, including the National Bank, the credit system that Lynn is, because that's the future. The credit system is that all value is in the future. Now that's a tough one for people. Value is not realized in what you do in the present, it's what you contribute to the future and the ability of the future to create a new future. And in a sense, what happened is that after the disaster of the 14th century, the plague, which was created by Venice, by the Venetian imperial system, the Bardi and Peruzzi and so forth, you had a rise of a renaissance, which was what developed modern science. Nicholas of Cusa, leading to Kepler, and all of modern science. But Cusa knew that this republic that he was describing, and he describes it in Concordantia Catholica, could not be realized in Europe. And so he said, go to the New World. Go somewhere far from the oligarchy. And some people tried to do it, Columbus being one of them. Some of the projects failed. But in North America, some succeeded, particularly the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And this was Cusa's idea of a republic against an oligarchy founded in North America, which ultimately led to the American Revolution. And indeed, to this day, that American Revolution stands as the greatest victory against the oligarchy. That's what makes the Jackson period so important. That's what makes understanding what has allowed us to progress since then. And we've had large periods of regression, and now we're about to lose everything. 40 years of basically increasing monetarist, speculative, financial empire ruling much of the globe. There's opposition. And indeed, as this comes to an existential point, there will be more opposition. But it will be mostly existential. It'll be anger. It'll be momentary reaction. And what it needs is leadership, just as the American Revolution was based on leadership, just as Cusa led the process, just as John Quincy Adams virtually created the nation, knowing what the American system was, just as Lincoln stood on that. That's the kind of leadership that Lynn represents, and is, of course, in one sense, demanding of a small number of people in the country who will lead their congressmen, not the other way around. We too often go and beg Congress. Please, you have the power. No, they don't, because they don't have the brains. They might have some power, but they don't have the brains. And so you have to lead them. And you'll find others, and you will find individuals in the Congress who, as you take them as individuals, are not so bad. But when they get thrown into the Congress and the party system, if they stand up, they suffer the consequences. We have to give them a sense that they will be backed up. Because if they follow us, we will back them up. And the example of Lincoln, I think, my point is to capture the whole person, the whole figure in history, a historic figure, a towering figure. And that's why if you wanted to do something about Lincoln, it would have to be a great epic tragedy, or epic drama, and not a slice of life, even if it's a nice slice of life. And we should understand what leadership really is. All the things that are said, you know, he was depressed, he had family problems. It's all gossip. I don't know. Maybe he was depressed. Watching 600,000 people die is not a happy thing. Maybe he was troubled. Maybe he was tortured by, personally, by every decision he had to make. He pardoned more soldiers than anybody. Stanton used to have a fit. He would look for an excuse to pardon the soldier. He once said, how can you execute an 18-year-old boy for, you know, being AWOL? Right? Right. But he also knew that it was a life and death matter. Okay, so I'm going to leave it at that because it's getting late.